welcoming our next guest, Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. He is the Senior Director of the Agri-food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University, otherwise known as the Food Professor, and arguably Canada's leading scholar on all things food. So, Dr. Charlebois, thank you very much for joining us on Consumer Choice Radio.
My pleasure.
Great. So, I mean, the pandemic has obviously been an interesting time in regards to food policy, and we're talking about supply chains and shortages and what's on shelves. But one thing that you've been talking a lot about lately is food inflation. And so I just wanted your take on how bad it's going to get and what some of the root causes are.
Well, so every year we actually publish Canada's food price report along with my colleagues from the University of Guelph, the University of Saskatchewan, and UBC. And for 11 years now, we've actually released a report, a forecast basically for the next 12 months in terms of how prices will behave at retail. And last December, we actually released a pretty scary report. We were expecting the food inflation rate to be at about 5%, which would equal to an increase of about $700 for an average family of four in Canada, which would be historically the highest jump ever we would see in Canada. And it's happening basically due to two wild cards that we actually anticipated. One, the climate. I mean, I think the climate is really the one wild card we have to deal with every year now. And it really, the northern hemisphere has been hard hit by really harsh weather. There's been some heat waves, droughts in Canada, the US, Russia even. Europe was impacted by floods. And so that's really, inventories are expected to be much lower than average, so we're hoping that the southern hemisphere will pick up the pace for their summer, which is coming. But for the time being, we are expecting processors to pay more. The other wild card, obviously, is COVID. COVID is really hitting two very important factors in food distribution. One, logistics. To move anything around right now around the world is actually 3-4 times the price, and we don't see how it's going to change anytime soon, at least until probably mid 2022. It's costing way more. There's no cargo space, and there is cargo space. It's basically costing more for food companies to move things around. And the other one is labor. I mean, labor, there's a labor shortage everywhere around the world, including Canada. And so to retain staffing, and you need staff to get things done in the food supply chain, well, it's actually costing more. We're seeing collective agreements. Just a couple of days ago, there was one collective agreement settled in Quebec with an increase of, get this, 15% during the first year in processing. So you can tell that really workers are trying to capitalize on this really political momentum they have. They have more currency. Consumers are aware that they exist. They want them to get paid more. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, someone is going to have to pay for all this. And that's really what's going to happen.
We're listening to Consumer Choice Radio. We're here with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. I'll pick on David very quickly. David, it's actually the easiest name to say in Quebec because everybody knows Charlebois, Rabbi Charlebois.
That's right.
So
we're not related. That's the unfortunate
thing.
Unfortunately,
yes. I played that song at my wedding, Je reviendrai à Montréal. So one question that I had relates to what you're talking about with raising prices. And often, for the people who might be in, Toronto, Montreal, or might be in Halifax, and they go to the nice grocery stores, they're used to paying a bit higher prices for, the quality products. But what does this mean for sort of your average modest family? They might be on lower income. They have lower disposable income. What will that mean if prices on food, ordinary food items goes up? That's something that is not really focused on in this conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, well, first of all, when you walk into a grocery store, you have access to over 18 to 20,000 different products. So you have options as a consumer. And so what we're expecting from consumers is that most will trade down or laterally. They may actually change brand. The one thing that we've noticed also this summer, barbecue season hasn't been all that great for the meat trifecta, by the way. So meats are 20% of all the money we spend on food. And Canadians are actually walking away a little bit from the meat counter. Beef is up 10%, pork is up 5%, chicken is up slightly 3-4%, and consumers have noticed they're spending less. So we actually just got results from a report coming out of Nelson IQ, and pork sales are down 17%, chicken 12%, and beef 6%. So this summer wasn't great, and prices aren't dropping either. I know a lot of people are saying, "Oh, it's all about supply and demand." In meat counter economics, it doesn't work that way, really. Grocers will defend margins as much as possible, and they will set price point based on what they think the market can bear. That's basically how it works. Okay, so they're not going to bring down prices, because bringing up prices again after a period of discounting is very, very difficult to do. So that's why they don't play around with prices. They'd rather sell less and protect margins than basically give the product away for a while and try to bring these prices up again. So right now, what we're seeing are Canadians that are really more food literate. They know their options more so than ever before beyond the meat counter. So they'll look at vegetable proteins. Tofu sales are up, for example. Meat alternative sales are up. So you can see that really Canadians are looking beyond the meat counter to save a little bit of money.
And obviously we're in the midst of an election. In your view, have any of the parties put forward any kind of serious policy recommendations in terms of tackling the rising prices for food?
First of all, I'm actually shocked that inflation is actually getting a lot of attention during an election. Like, often you have some very populist issues, well, important issues, healthcare, for example. You often hear issues like, for example, public financing, women's rights. I mean, these are all very important political issues, but inflation is not a sexy topic to talk about as a party. But we have heard a lot about food inflation in recent weeks, which is great. I mean, people are concerned about the cost of living, and personally, I'm not overly worried or concerned about inflation in general in Canada, because we actually are expecting the inflation rate to drop. But we do look at one specific thing, food inflation, and we don't see the same picture, unfortunately. We are expecting food prices to go up. In fact, in the Western world, not just Canada, in the Western world, food prices are going up. They're going up in Europe. They're going up in the United States as well. And so Canada is not immune to all this. So obviously you have to be concerned. But the one party that I thought really did a good job in tackling issues that is within a government's control, as far as I'm concerned, is the Progressive Conservative Party. I think Mr. O'Toole presented a platform a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was really interesting. You can't really control, unless you want to fix prices at retail or regulate prices at retail or nationalize food distribution, which I don't think Canadians want. You can't really control food inflation, but you can control misbehavior. You can also look into issues that can bring prices higher, like the bread price fixing scheme, which occurred for 14 years in Canada. So no one has actually received a fine. No one has gone to prison. Where in the United States, whenever there's a price fixing scheme scandal erupting, people do go to jail and they are fined. Not in Canada, unfortunately. And that bread price fixing scheme was actually disclosed I believe now 4 years ago, and the investigation is still ongoing. So that's the one thing that perhaps a government can do to kind of try to make sure that the entire supply chain is in sync. The other thing that Mr. O'Toole has presented is the possibility of installing a code of conduct, basically encouraging more supply chain diplomacy and discipline. Because right now, grocers in Canada, unlike Europe or the United States, grocers have a lot of power and they're using it. They're abusing it, really. They're implementing fees. There are only 5 companies selling 90% of all the food we eat in Canada. So they have a lot of power, a lot of power. And so Mr. O'Toole has said that we need a code of conduct in order for processors to have a shot at making a living, a decent living, which is really, these are things that governments can do.
Oh, Loblaws writes the laws. Whoever would have thought that.
Exactly.
One of David's favorite topics here has to do with, speaking of price fixing, supply management is something that hasn't really been an issue in this campaign. It was in the last federal campaign. We did hear a lot about it and a lot of the different kerfuffles among the conservative sort of frontrunners. What is the kind of status quo on supply management right now, and how does that actually impact families? And if you could explain that as well. I know not everybody is as well read as David on supply management, nor are they critical. So sort of what is the impact of that, and could there be some modifications to make it so that Canadians would pay less in grocery bills every month?
Well, yeah, no, it's it's an important topic, but it's a topic that politicians tend to avoid now. And just talk to Maxime Bernier. He knows. I mean, the political costs that you have to pay as a politician to actually even question the existence of our supply management regime comes with great risks. That's basically the reality. That's why I'm not surprised to hear a whole lot. Now, in terms of affordability, I'm not convinced that supply management is actually pushing prices higher, generally speaking. They're very stable. If you look at chicken, eggs, milk, Canadians have been well served. The challenge, of course, is that we're seeing a very obscure and opaque industry. If you think of Buttergate, for example, when all of a sudden Canadians actually realized that cows were fed with a byproduct of palm oil coming from Asia, for example, when the Dairy Farmers of Canada's motto is all about Canada and Canadian through and through, all of a sudden people realize, and butter, the quality of butter actually was compromised. Butter was actually harder. And so people are willingly paying a higher price for butter, but they're expecting quality, but they weren't getting it anymore. So in my view, supply management or the quota system should remain in place, because tomorrow, if we get rid of our quota system, we would actually see an entire industry collapse in Canada. We're not competitive. However, it needs to improve. And I think that dairy farmers, especially dairy farmers, need to be made accountable towards the Canadian public much more so than they are now. Right now, what we're seeing are politicians giving out checks and they with zero conditions, which is really a mistake.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I mean, on transitioning away from supply management, that's something that I've written about at length several times. I know that it's something that you've kind of hinted at in terms of a possibility maybe at some point in regards to what our options are. From my point of view, I just can't find a justification to keep supply management when we don't do that for beef or for other agricultural products. So it kind of leaves me scratching my head. But I wonder, what is the best way forward? So if we are going to reform the system, obviously keeping them accountable is important to ensure quality. But is there a way where we could open up market share maybe a little more aggressively than the 2% here or 3% here to have a more competitive marketplace? Or have they just become so dependent on protection that that's not feasible?
I for the longest time I thought that supply management was absolutely an obsolete system in Canada. The But what I've come to realize over the years is that there's too much fiscal baggage linked to supply management. The reason why I spent a year in Europe, in Innsbruck, Austria, in 2015, was to actually interview many, many people in the dairy sector as the quota system was ending in Europe. If you remember, over 13 years, they actually just got rid of their quota system. And now Canada is the only country in the world with a quota system. And so I was there to interview different dairy farmers, co-ops, dairy processors. And I must say the regime in Europe was very different in Canada. In Canada, uh, it would be it is impossible to find one dairy farmer who's not satisfied with the system. In Europe, there were levies, there were extra costs, there were variations between regions, between countries, and frankly, there were a lot of dairy producers who were dissatisfied with the system. Not in Canada. The other reality in Canada is that we're just north of a superpower called the United States. And the dairy sector in the United States is much more competitive than in Canada. So if we are to retain some capacity in Canada, in my view, we need to keep the quota system. However, instead of giving $1.9 billion just in compensation, whatever that means, I actually do think that we need to think about, encouraging some dairy farmers who are bringing that level of quality down, that level of competitive down, to exit the industry altogether. Because I actually do think that we have too many dairy farmers who are just not performing well, and this is the hard conversation we need to have in Canada.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you joining us, Dr. Charlebois. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure we'll have to have you back soon to talk more about food.
My pleasure.